Hi, I'm Marty Nemko. Regular viewers of this YouTube channel, my YouTube channel, know that I usually read my own work and only occasionally read essays of other people. And usually those are those that stood the test of time. But I read just today something that I felt is really important, and not because it advocates for Jews, and I am Jewish, although an atheist, but because of its implications for everyone. And so I commend it to your attention. It's called The Vanishing, from a publication called The Tablet, the subtitle, The Erasure of Jews from American Life. Suddenly, everywhere you look, the Jews are disappearing. You feel it like a slow-moving pressure system, an anxiety of exclusion and downward mobility. Maybe you first noticed it at your workplace, or maybe it hit when you or your children applied to college or graduate school. It could have been something as simple as opening up the Netflix splash page. It's gauche to count, but you can't help yourself. In academia, Hollywood, Washington, even in New York City, where such a high concentration of people are Jewish, anywhere American Jews once made their mark, our influence is in steep decline. For many Jews, the first instinct is to look inward. We blame intermarriage, assimilation, the loss of the immigrant work ethic. This is, of course, a cope. Because the most significant cause of the decline isn't Jews themselves, but that American liberalism, our civic religion, has turned on us. Where Jewish success was once upheld as a sign of America's strength and progress over its prejudices, Jewish overrepresentation is again something to be solved, not celebrated. A tenure-track humanities professor at a prestigious public university tells of the finalists for her department's next graduate school cohort. Of the 20 or so candidates, 4 to 5 are Jewish. One is a working-class yeshiva applicant with an incredible backstory and even better recommendations. He is passed over for not being diverse enough. Of course, our professor doesn't complain. Her own tenure is at risk. In the end, not a single Jew is offered admission. Another Jewish professor applies to work in the UC system, University of California. In his mandatory diversity statement, which he describes as the most shameful piece of writing I've ever done, his sole aim is to convey the impression that he hopes to be the last Jewish man I ever hire. He still doesn't get the job. And why would he? Using U.gov data, Eric Kaufman finds that just 4% of elite American academics under 30 are Jewish, compared with 21% of boomers. The steep decline of Jewish editors at the Harvard Law Review, down roughly 50% in less than 10 years, could be the subject of its own Law Review article. The same pattern holds across America's elite institutions, a slow-moving downward trend from the 1990s to the mid-2010s, likely due to all sorts of normal sociological factors, and then a purge so sweeping and dramatic, you almost wonder who sent out the secret memo. Museum boards now diversify by getting Jews to resign. A well-respected Jewish curator at the Guggenheim is purged after she puts on a Basquiat show. At the Art Institute of Chicago, even the nice Jewish lady volunteers are terminated for having the wrong ethnic background. There's an entire cottage industry of summer programs and fellowships and postdocs that are now off-limit to Jews. In 2014, there were 16 to 20 Jewish artists featured at the Whitney Biennial. After a very public campaign against a Jewish board member with ties to the Israeli defense establishment, the curators got the message. The 2022 Biennial featured just 1 to 2, down from 16 to 20. Comb through the dozens of Jewish names for the 2012 Guggenheim Fellowship, I count 30 to 40. You'll have a much harder time finding them 10 years later, 14 to 16. There were 3 to 4 Jewish Marshall Scholars in 2014. I don't see any in 2022. From 2010 through 2019, there were at least 3 Jews in every MacArthur Fellowship class, as the Genius Fellowship, sometimes as many as 5 or 6. The Forward, a liberal Jewish publication, would write effusive columns celebrating the year's Jewish geniuses. Since 2020, just 0 or 1 Jew a year have been awarded grants. The Forward hasn't bothered to take note. Today, American Jews watch with Solomonic bemusement as Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard is argued before the Supreme Court. On some level, we sympathize with the Asian American plaintiffs who are suing Harvard for using admission criteria that discriminate against them on the basis of their race. Maybe they really are the new Jews, facing the same barriers, insidious racism, personality scores, rural geographic preferences that we once did. On the other hand, fancying ourselves to be high-caste members of a beneficent elite, we pretend not to notice that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a cudgel used to exclude certain groups of Americans, including Asians and Jews. Desperate to maintain their waning status within the liberal coalition, Jewish communal organizations ignore these contradictions. Once a protector of specifically Jewish interests but now secure in its new role as handmaiden to power, the Anti-Defamation League filed an amicus brief in support of Harvard. In the 1940s, the Anti-Defamation League took a different tack. For decades, unofficial quotas at most Ivy League universities limited Jews to around 10% of the student body, despite ever more qualified Jewish applicants. Jewish organizations made it their mission to break this invisible barrier, and by the end of the 1950s, the quotas were a dead letter. The long summer of American Jewish success had begun. But the seasons always change. A Fire YouGov survey found that self-identified Jews now number just 7% of Ivy League students, compared to 10% during the height of the anti-Semitic quotas. In his gripping podcast Gatecrashers about the history of Jews in the Ivy League, Mark Oppenheimer describes a troubled state of Jewish campus life. Harvard has gone from being 25% Jewish in the 1990s and 2000s to under 10% today. Quote, in theory, it could be the case that Jews are of the same percentage of whites at Harvard as they always were, end quote, he explains. But Harvard has not shrunk the number of athletes, admits, and they have kept their geographical diversity. So if you're a Jewish kid who's not an athlete and not a legacy and not from Wyoming, then there's not much room for you. According to the Hillel College Guide, Penn, University of Pennsylvania's Jewish population declined from 26% in 2015 to 17% in 2021. The NYU's dropped from 24% to 13%. Princeton, Columbia, and Cornell have seen smaller but significant declines. Brown and Dartmouth, with different institutional priorities, are by all accounts happy exceptions. Data from the Yale Chaplain's Office, which appears to be the only Ivy League university that still tracks religious affiliation, shows a similar trend. The Jewish population went from 20% in the 2000s to 16.4% in the 2010s. A couple years ago, the school's chaplain told Meir Chaim Posner, the Chabad rabbi at Yale, that around 11% of Yale undergraduates were Jewish. It's dropped slightly since then, Rabbi Posner told me in November. Quote, the university has decided that DEI is the overarching principle of admissions, one Hillel director told me. There's a general consensus that it's more difficult for Jewish students to get into top-tier schools, end quote. Nor is this difficulty confined to secular Jews. The modern Orthodox population has also crashed. A college counselor at a top Jewish day school reports that as universities have revamped enrollment and gone test optional, the number of Orthodox students has decreased. Quote, every year has been harder. Our ability to thoughtfully predict the likelihood of admission has gone way down, end quote. An uneasy omerta settles in. The Ivy skip college nights at Jewish day schools that they visited for decades. At Penn, there used to be 2 daily minions at services. Now there's 1. There are hushed whispers that if current trends hold, some of these colleges may no longer be able to support an Orthodox community at all. The 1999 Hillel College Guide now reads like a map to a lost civilization. Harvard and Yale have 1,500 Jewish undergrads apiece. There are 5,000 Jewish students and grad students at Columbia, 6,000 at Penn, 14,000 at NYU. It's hard to imagine that as recently as 2008, articles were being written about the race to attract Jewish students. What was normal less than 2 decades ago sounds like a siren call from a distant golden age. To even suggest that a 15 to 20% Jewish undergraduate student body might be acceptable in a country in which Jews make up 2.4% of the total population is anathema in today's liberal society. In New York, the seat of American Jewish political power, there are almost no Jews left in power. A decade ago, the city had 5 Jewish congressmen, a Jewish mayor, 2 Jewish borough presidents, and 14 Jewish city council members. Today, just 2 congressmen and a single borough president remain. Only 6 Jews now sit on the 51-person city council. Shelley Silver, the corrupt Orthodox former state assembly leader, was replaced by Yu Lin Yu, a pro-BDS progressive whose oligarch father was featured in the Panama Papers. Not even the Lower East Side's Tenement Museum is recognizably Jewish anymore. Quote, what you have is a lack of identity of Jews as Jews, end quote, the Democratic political consultant Hank Scheinkoff told the Washington Post. And they don't have the power to ensure that there's more than one Jewish congressman. It's astounding. Younger Jews are being excluded from the liberal organizations their parents and grandparents helped create. Identitarian meltdowns roiled the progressive world. The Women's March, the ACLU, the SPLC all get rid of Jewish leadership. There will be no more mighty IRAs in our lifetime. Not even the Jewish president of the Audubon Society is safe. There still are powerful Jews in Washington. Neo-Nazis on Twitter like to post photos of Biden's cabinet. But the influence is waning. Is it a coincidence that in the U.S. Senate, a handy group of old men, if there ever was one, the only senator forced to resign during the Me Too panic just happened to be Jewish? Or that activists pushed for Dianne Feinstein's resignation for the explicit reason that she be replaced by somebody who isn't Jewish? Of the 114 federal judges appointed by Joe Biden as of this writing, just 8 to 9 appear to be Jewish in a field that's historically been at least 20% Jewish. Liberals worship Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a magical Jewish Teletubby, but they wouldn't dare nominate another white woman to the highest court anytime soon. We are back to the single Jewish seat on the court. Apparently Jews have so much power and influence that the highest-ranking Jewish senator in history finds it too politically difficult to hire a 22-year-old version of himself. There were at least 15 Jews on Chuck Schumer's staff of 64 in 2014. After pressure for not being diverse enough, and despite an enlarged staff of 89, he can no longer make a minyan, that's 10. In Los Angeles, America's second most Jewish city, there are now just 2 Jewish city council members, down from 6 in 2000. In last year's infamous dust-up, Nuri Martinez, the sharp-tongued council president, had despicable things to say about black people, Oaxacans, even Armenians, but Jews were barely a footnote. Judeos cut their deal with South L.A., she said. They're going to screw everybody else. Speaking of L.A., a decade ago there were 22 Jews on the Hollywood Reporter's annual list of the top 50 showrunners. In 2022 it's down to 13. Other than the half-Jewish and already famous Maggie Gyllenhaal, you'll have to go back 6 years to find a single Jew on Variety's annual list of 10 directors to watch. Thanks to the odious new Hollywood house style that requires a detailed ethnic and racial classification at the top of all capsule biographies, we can see just how many self-identified Jews are in the Sundance Writers and Directors Labs, or NBC, Paramount, and Disney writers and apprenticeship programs. It's 0. It seems not being Jewish is actually a primary qualification. So much for the Jewish control of Hollywood. The decline is so rapid, and the golden age so close to living memory it's a running joke. On the latest season of Curb Your Enthusiasm, Larry David meets with a group of younger, non-Jewish studio executives to convince them to cast a Mexican-American girl as young Larry's Jewish love interest. On Reboot, Steve Letterman's Hulu show, an old guard of Jewish sitcom writers clash uncomfortably with their younger and woker and notably non-Jewish colleagues. Not even Hollywood's Jewish history belongs to Jews anymore. The new Academy Museum dedicated to, quote, radical inclusivity and paid for with Chaim Saban's Jewish money, couldn't bring itself to include Hollywood's Jewish founders. In Babylon, Damien Chazelle's epic flop about Hollywood's golden age, the director follows an ahistorical Mexican studio executive and an Asian American lesbian, rather than any of the very real Jewish moguls or screenwriters or directors of that era. What's telling isn't that Chazam ignored Jews, anyone can do that, but not a single reviewer bothered to notice this erasure. The culture has moved on. What remains of Jewish Hollywood lives on borrowed time. Spielberg can make his Fabelmans, James Gray his Armageddon time, but only because these are nostalgia pieces. Soon there will be no more RBGs, no more Spielbergs, just a few off-brand Seinfelds doing a Heritage Act. There will certainly never be another Larry King or Andy Borowitz. Jews are such astounding mediocrity, you wonder what was in the water. In the 1950s, after Stalin's death, after the purges, the Politburo turned to another pressing issue, the overrepresentation of Jews in Soviet life. Proportional representation, 3% Tajik, 2% Uzbek, 12% Ukrainian, became official policy, and the next decade saw the quick erosion of the Jewish nomenclatura. Soviet Jews, who had disproportionately contributed to and benefited from the building of the communist state, had outlived their usefulness. A 1964 New York Times article explained that because Soviet republics assigned a certain number of students preferential admission based on their nationalities, other nationalities, also known as Jews, were excluded. Quote, A higher percentage of Jewish students were permitted to attend universities in Tsarist Russia than is enrolled in the USSR today, an outraged American Jewish Congress declared. Quote, the 8.2% of university graduates are Jews contrasts sharply with the present Jewish university enrollment of 3.2%. As true believers in the post-war liberal project, American Jews spent decades advocating for tolerance and equality of opportunity, not least because we were the prime beneficiaries. The ADL didn't fight the quotas in the 50s, so Jews could matriculate in proportion to their percentage of the population. But there is tension between meritocracy and representation. The new DEI regime treats any disparity between groups as evidence of unfair advantage, and yet we're supposed to think it's a coincidence that Jewish representation plummets at the exact moment America frantically pushes to racially rebalance all high-status industries. Because what is framed as a backlash against America's white centers of power is in many cases a clever sleight of hand. Jews are being disproportionately purged from liberal institutions because Jews disproportionately exist within those institutions. When activists and journalists and executives talk about how Broadway or NPR or publishing is too white, what they mean is too Jewish. When the New York Times says it wants to make its internal demographics look more like New York City, except the Hasidim, of course, what it means is fewer Jews. 20 years ago, if Pat Robertson spoke along those lines, making the same complaints about the same people in industries and institutions, there would have been a rush to condemn it as anti-Semitic. Today, it passes for social justice. In the 60s and 70s, facing hard barriers to their professional advancement, Soviet Jews lost the faith. The children and the grandchildren of the revolution tried to emigrate. When the authorities wouldn't let them, American Jews rallied to their cause, created brand new communal organizations, petitioned Congress, rallied thousands strong outside the United Nations. Ours was a community confident in its power and confident in its future. Asian Americans have the dignity of looking at admissions practice and demanding fair representation. The Jews, as ever, are a people apart. From civil rights to Vietnam to the spectacular bounty of their cultural and political achievements, liberal Jewish boomers always manage to be on the right side of history. It is a supreme irony that they've helped empower a movement that now places their children and grandchildren on the wrong side. If Putin or Orban reduced their university's Jewish population by 50%, the Anti-Defamation League would be howling. But Harvard and Yale can magically lose nearly half their Jewish students in less than a decade, and will take it on the chin. That this is occurring with the full acquiescence of a terrified liberal Jewish establishment should tell you just how much power Jews in America still have. In any case, that essay is called The Vanishing. As usual, not by me. This is by a guy named Jacob Savage in a publication called The Tablet. As usual, I welcome your thumbs up and accept your thumbs down. I always look forward to your comments, and especially like it if you hit the share button below. Share on your social media so that my efforts can have broader impact. And I am flattered if you choose to subscribe to my channel. In any event, I do thank you for watching. I am Marty Nemko.